Hello and welcome to the Beach House 34 podcast. I'm your host, Christine Worth. Welcome to the new subscribers and welcome back to our devoted listeners. If you're here, you know that I've covered the Darlie Routier Trial transcripts from the very beginning. And this is the mother who in 1997 was accused and convicted of murdering her two children in Rowlett, Texas. If you're brand new here and you want to start from the very beginning, you'll find all of the trial transcripts in their own playlist on YouTube, and they're all numbered in order for you. The actual trial testimony is over at this point. The verdict has been rendered, and the verdict was guilty. And we're now in that phase of the trial where the attorneys are giving their arguments before the jury goes off to decide Darlie's fate, either the death penalty or life in prison. Now we start with Sherri Wallace of the prosecution. And at this point, the jury has been given the charge of the court. So in other words, their instructions. And then this is the time when the attorneys begin their closing arguments or do their closing arguments in regards to the punishment phase. And we begin with the prosecution, Miss Sherri Wallace, and she begins with her argument. The court says, and now argument by agreement, 90 minutes aside. And who will open for the state? Miss Wallace? Miss Sherri Wallace says, I will, Your Honor. And the court says, thank you. And Miss Wallace says, may it please the court? And the court says, yes, ma'am. Miss Wallace then continues. On June the 6th, of 1996, two precious children were forever silenced by their Devin and Damon Routier were forever silenced by their mother. On their behalf and on behalf of the people of this great state, I want to thank you for your wisdom and your common sense in sifting through 4 weeks of testimony and telling us the truth. I know this case has been difficult. It's been difficult on all of us. You don't want to believe that a mother would kill her children. You fight in yourself and you say it is not so. But in this case, as you saw, the evidence is overwhelming. This woman over here, her children in cold blood. And then that family comes in here and tries to make you feel guilty for their loss, tries to blame you for their pain. She is to blame. It's her fault they're hurting. It's her fault we're here. So don't you feel bad for 1 minute for holding on to your oath and for sifting through all of that horrible evidence and for reaching a just verdict. For that, we thank you. So Rilda Routier said, the defendant's own mother-in-law, quote, if she did this, she should die. We know that she did this. Now, it's up to you to decide if she lives or dies. Now, you remember from the jury selection we did, it seems so long ago. It's not that clear. Instead of saying life or death, the court has asked you to answer 2 questions. But in this case, the answers are so easy because the answers are in the evidence. The answers are contained in the defendant's crime. The first question, is there a probability that she would commit further continuing acts of violence, that she would be a continuing threat? I want you to think about the crime when you answer that question. You see, folks, this isn't some crime where she snapped. This isn't a case where we have got an automatic weapon and a mom just freaked out. She planned this thing. She thought about it for a week. She had been sleeping downstairs for a week. She told the nurse in the hospital that she had been leaving that window open in the garage for a week. And then that night, what did she do? She sat there and she waited until her babies fell asleep. And she walks into the kitchen. Can you imagine what is going through her mind? She stands there and looks at that butcher block and thinks, what knife, what weapon am I going to use to kill my children? How did she select it? Was it the biggest one? I don't know. But she pulled it out. And you know what? She could have stopped right then. She could have said, oh my God, what am I doing? But she didn't. She goes over to her child, and the sequence of events I'm going to tell you is a reasonable deduction from the evidence. I don't know exactly how she did this crime, but I'll tell you what I think. what I think the evidence shows. She went over to Devin, her oldest child. He's laying there sleeping. Is there anything more precious than a sleeping child? Anything. You know how they get when they fall asleep and they start breathing heavily, just that deep sleep because they are exhausted from playing all day. That's how Devin was. She walks up to him and looks at him. He is face up, sleeping. He is dreaming. I don't know what he is dreaming about, riding bikes, licking popsicles. I don't know what he's dreaming about, but it's nothing like the nightmare that awoke him. She awoke him. She did it by taking that knife and slamming it into his chest. She plunged it into his chest. And she could have stopped then. And if you are asked this question, would she probably be a future danger? Would she probably commit criminal acts of violence? Right then, what would you say? Surely not. Not a mother. That would snap her. Surely she realizes her wrong. But no, she does it again until she is sure he is dead. And then she walks over to her 5-year-old child, Damon. Look at those eyes, those precious eyes. He is face down. He is sleeping too. And she has a chance at this point to stop and say, oh my God, I have made the most horrible mistake of my life. I can't do it to another child. But she doesn't. She is that cold. These kids are in her way, and she has got a mission and a goal, and she carries it out. And she goes over and she Damon. Do you know what it is like to something? Have you ever a chicken? It's hard. She had to go through bone and pull it out and do it again. And I don't know what happened then. Maybe she thought she had done it with 2 times. But do you remember what Barbara Jovell said about this little boy? He was stubborn. He was a fighter. He didn't want to die. So she goes off and does whatever she does. Flipping stuff around, taking that, just turning that flower arrangement over, putting the vacuum cleaner there, cutting herself, whatever she does. Okay. And she stages that crime scene. And then you know what happened next. Because we know from the blood trail that little boy left. He's trying to get out of there. He crawls away and she goes after him and hunts him down like an animal. And she finishes him off. Those big eyes, as he is dying, are looking up at her. You heard the paramedic talk about it. He was choked up. It's hard to watch a little boy die. And what did their mother do? Not one dadgum thing. Not even then did she stop. All she did was hold that towel on her neck and ask when the heck the ambulance was going to be there for herself. Have any of y'all ever lost somebody you really loved? You know what it's like to have something suddenly taken away from you? You don't ever want to believe it. You live in denial. You remember when she testified in the guilt or innocence phase of this trial, and she told you when she got in the ambulance, she knew her babies were dead. Well, they hadn't even declared Damon dead. She knew they were dead because she knew she had him hard enough. She knew she had finished him off. So you have got to answer that first question. And this crime gives you everything you need to answer that first question. You see, the law doesn't require, we talked about this in jury selection. The law doesn't require anything else. There are some crimes that are so bad, that are so distasteful, that are so horrible, that that's all you need to hear. If we had asked this question after Devin's death, maybe we would still have Damon. How long are we going to wait? You all know she is a continuing threat. She is a threat to anything that gets in her way. As long as you don't cross her, everything is fine. But if you get in her way, God help you. Now, I want you, if you will, to think about this woman, because that is really what this second question is all about. Is there something here sufficient after that crime to warrant y'all changing your mind and giving her life, even though she deserves death? That's what it's all about. Well, what evidence have you heard? Well, the family doesn't want to believe it's true. The truth is too ugly for them to face. But you have sat here for now almost, well, the 4.5 weeks, and you know the truth. They have not been in this courtroom. They don't know all you have heard, and they don't want to believe it. Who does? But that's the case. So think about this woman. Are you not going to kill her because she is a woman? Does that make those kids one bit less dead? All of you were asked on your questionnaire, could you execute a woman if the crime called for it? And every single one of you answered yes. So I ask you, if a stranger had broken into this home and done this, look at it, done this to two little boys, what would you do to that stranger? Well, I have talked to you all. I have heard from you. I know what you would do. You would kill him in a heartbeat. Don't you know that their mother doing this is so much worse? So take the fact that she is a woman out of the question. So is there anything sufficiently mitigating? Any reason for you to change the right verdict? Well, think about what she said. You all have seen that. We call it the silly string tape. You have seen it. It's the 14th. It's 8 days after these babies are slaughtered. And she stands before that camera and has the gall to say that these children have had such rich and full lives. You tell me, how does somebody that hasn't even gotten to kindergarten yet have the chance to have a rich and full life? Her mother asked you to have compassion. I ask you to have as much compassion for her as she had for her children. You have heard evidence in this phase of the trial about this woman. You have heard, it doesn't matter if she doesn't wear a bra. I don't care if she doesn't wear a bra. That's not the point. The point is that what you see here in this courtroom is a sham. She is out there in our communities. She is rude. She is not this, all you heard was what a doting mother she was, how kind and gentle she was. Well, excuse my language, but get the over here to a 3 and 4-year-old. That's who you're asked to sentence. She didn't care about these kids. They want you to think there is something mitigating about she bought them a lot of stuff. Well, yeah, that's the easy way. Buy them stuff. Maybe they will shut up. Maybe they will go outside and play. That's how you know if the Routiers are home. Kids are running wild outside. Mama doesn't want them in the house. She doesn't have time for them. She took care of that, didn't she? Some of you may be thinking, maybe she ought to get a life sentence. Maybe that would be worse. That would be a greater form of hell because she would have to think about her crime for the rest of her life. That's a mistake. And I'll tell you why. Because she is not like we are. She is different, very different. The only concern she's got, the only time you saw real tears is when she is worried about her own hide. And she doesn't give a flip about anybody else. A life sentence isn't going to work for her, people. She doesn't have the guilt. Knowing her life is about to end is the only thing that will affect her. I think the most scary thing is that she looks like us. She looks like a human being, but she is not. She is not one bit like us. We couldn't do this. We don't even know somebody that could do this. This is one of those crimes that is unthinkable. You may be wondering, but why? Why would she do it? We don't have to prove motive, but you want to know why. You have heard some of the evidence about what she was going through, but there's not a good reason to stab a 5 and 6-year-old boy. There is nothing I could say to you where you would go, oh, I understand now. I understand why she stabbed her children. Senseless crimes. That's what they are called. You know why they are called senseless crimes? Because they don't make sense. But they happen, and the people that do them are so evil. We reserve the death penalty for those people. We reserve the death penalty for people like Darlie Routier. If she did it, she should die. She did it. You all have got a tremendous opportunity. There are juries today all around the state that are called on to make decisions. And people oftentimes don't hear about them. But people are going to hear about your verdict. People are paying attention to this case. All of those people are press. There's camera people in here and writers and TV people and book people, and they are all waiting to see what you do with this case. They are your messengers. I ask you to tell this nation in Texas, we protect our children. If you harm our children, you will get the full extent of our laws. I know this decision isn't easy. It shouldn't be. But if you look at this evidence and you think about this crime, you think about the fact that all of the time that she had where she could have stopped, where she could have changed her mind, but she kept plowing on through because that is what she wanted. You think about those things. You think about these babies. Think about the last few minutes of their life. What did they say to her? Mommy, it hurts. Mommy, why? I don't know, but it hurt. And it wasn't instant, and she didn't care. In order for the defendant to die, you must answer the first question, yes, and you must answer the second question, no. If you answer them any differently, she receives a life sentence. You must all be in agreement that the first question is answered yes, and the second question is answered no. Every single one of you has to agree to that verdict. I ask you to tell this nation, to tell this world, Darlie Routier, we are not going to tolerate what you have done to our children. You will die. The court says, thank you, Miss Wallace. And then at this point, the jury is excused for a 10-minute break, and proceedings continue between a few of the attorneys. And the court says, all right, these proceedings are being held outside the presence of the jury, and all parties in trial are present. The court's charge was read to the jury commencing at 9:15 a.m., and Miss Wallace argued for the state. And she began her argument at 9:23 a.m. and ending at 9:50 a.m. Mr. Darren Routier appeared in court at 9:40 a.m. All right, thank you. Are both sides ready to bring in the jury? Mr. Davis says, yes, sir, we are ready. Mr. Mulder says, yes, sir, we're ready. And the court says, all right, bring the jury in, please. Next up for closing arguments in this punishment phase is the defense attorney, Doug Mulder. And the court says, let the record reflect that all parties in the trial are present and the jury is seated. Mr. Mulder. Mr. Mulder says, yes, sir. May it please the court? And the court says, yes, sir. And Mr. Mulder then continues. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll be the first to visit with you on behalf of the defendant. And I think it would be less than candid of me to tell you that I am extremely disappointed in your verdict. But I believe in the system, and you are good people, and you went through this evidence sincerely, and you did your dead level best, and for that, I certainly appreciate it. And it's not my position, or anyone else's position, to quarrel with your verdict. The state's position is, at what we call the punishment hearing, to bring you evidence upon which they will later contend that you are to base your verdict that Darlie should die. And I want to discuss with you a little bit that testimony that they brought, and then I want to answer Miss Wallace's argument, if I can, and then I want to point out some things that I think are important and should be considered by you in arriving at a proper verdict in this case. The first witness that they called was a young lady by the name of Allison Hennessy. And she basically told you that she is a friend, or up until January of 1995, was a friend of Renee Stanley's, the little girl who lived down the street. And Renee Stanley would babysit for the Routiers from time to time, and that she would go over there to the Routiers' house. And she told you basically three things. She said that Darlie bought cigarettes for Renee. This is a 16-year-old. That one time she gave her a Zima, and another time she gave her a small quantity of. But it's curious to me that if the thrust of their proof is to show that these things actually happened, and I would caution you that this young lady is kind of kin to the case through Glenn Mize. She is the stepdaughter of Glenn Mize, who has this circuitous relationship with Basha, who is woven throughout this whole mystery. But if in fact the object is to prove that these things occurred, Why don't they bring Renee Stanley? I mean, doesn't that make sense? Where is Renee Stanley? I'll tell you where she is. They know, and neither one of them are going to get up here with a straight face and deny it. They know that Renee Stanley denies these allegations, you see. Now, the next lady to come in here and testify was Eileen Shermer. Remember, she is the one that lives some 2 blocks away and quarrels with the way the little bike riders are supervised. She didn't like the fact that they didn't wear life preservers on the dock. And that has, the birthday party with the cake in the face and the water gun and that. She is what we call a volunteer. You see, she is somebody who wants to get into the act. She doesn't really have anything to bring to the party. But when you call and you volunteer, it doesn't take long to figure out something that you can testify to, and you can get into the act and you can become a star. There is no way on God's green earth that they found her during some neighborhood canvass. She simply volunteered. Now, the next witness was Nelda Watts. And the interesting thing about her, she's the lady who heard the scream and saw the little black car out in front at her mailbox. And then when she heard the sirens and the emergency vehicles, she looked out there and it was gone. And nobody knows to this day what became of or how that black car fit into this mystery. I don't know why they weren't asking her about that. She has been there some 3 years and she has never spoken to Darlie and obviously doesn't even know what she looks like to be able to identify her at a distance. I mean, this is an obvious case of mistaken identity. But I wonder why she wasn't asked about the little black car instead of this other business that doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense. At any rate, the next witness called was also a volunteer, Kay Norris. And basically, she said she is trashy and she is rude and she doesn't approve of the language that she used to correct her children. I mean, I don't either, if in fact she used that language. But I suggest to you that if, in fact, that is what they set out to prove, they could bring somebody who doesn't have an obvious axe to grind. And I think Miss Norris does. But enough said about her. Helena. Helena is traceable back to Basha. And I think Rebecca sufficiently rebutted anything that she had to say. I think that, of course, I'm a little bit curious that the only time she has ever in her time here in the United States needed an interpreter was when she comes down here to testify in court. And that strikes me as somewhat unusual. I think from your common experiences that by using an interpreter, it's of course to her advantage, and she can find out where Mr. Mosty is going when he asks the questions. She is Basha's mother, and you have seen Basha, and I suggest to you that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. But be that as it may, if they were intent and wanted to bring you information of how she acted and how she treated those children, they have that information from the canvass that they did of that neighborhood. They talked to the fellow behind the house who saw Darren working on the fence that night. They have talked to everybody in that neighborhood. They can pay 10 grand to have some guy do that business on the 911 tape. And they have canvassed the neighborhood. And this is the best that they can come up with, that she has not been a good mother. And I'll tell you, it's absurd. If this is all they can come up with, and they have had her under a microscope for some 7 months, I think basically when you analyze a capital murder case with the idea of punishment and what should be or ought to be the proper punishment. And I would remind you again in this case that the law says that your decision should be the decision of 12 jurors, not 6 or 8 or 10 or 11, but it must be unanimous. So each of you is 100% responsible for the verdict. And that's the way it's supposed to be under our law. The law says, with respect to this first issue, it must be proven to you beyond all reasonable doubt. And that simply means this, that if you have any reasonable doubt, the law says that you resolve that doubt in favor of Darlie. each and every time. It doesn't make any difference whether it's once or 10 times or 21 times or 101 times. Each time you have a reasonable doubt, the law says you give her the benefit of that reasonable doubt. Now let's see if this makes sense. I suggest to you that there are 3 considerations in determining whether or not you've got a capital murder case that warrants the death penalty. The first one is the consideration of the victim. Who is the victim in this case? The second consideration should be the proof, okay? And the third consideration should be the defendant. To have a capital murder case that warrants death, you have got to have an innocent victim who did not provoke the killing. Does that make sense? You have got that here. No question about that. Nothing more innocent than a 5-year-old child. And I dare say there is absolutely nothing that a 5-year-old child could ever do under any circumstances to provoke his death. Now, what about proof? Well, you should want the proof to be so clear, so convincing, evidence that is so compelling, evidence that satisfies you in your heart of hearts that the defendant, to the exclusion of all other people, is solely responsible for the death of the victim. Does that make sense to y'all? Absolute proof. You know it in your heart of hearts. The evidence is so clear and convincing that you are convinced of her guilt to the exclusion of all others. Now, I think the third consideration should be the defendant. Is the defendant beyond redemption? Okay, let's talk a little bit about the proof in this case. And I think if Mr. Davis, and he talked last time, so I didn't have an opportunity to get up and answer him. And I would have liked to have answered him on a number of things. But again, I believe in the system, and that is the way the system operates. But if Mr. Davis is going to get up here with a straight face and ask you to set her punishment at death, then you are entitled to some answers and some explanations. I suggest to you that right now you don't have a clear picture on what exactly happened, how it happened, why it happened, or the time frame in which it happened. And I suggest to you that if they have proven their case to such an extent that they expect you to render a verdict of death, you would have those answers. You have held her responsible. I don't quarrel with that. I am surprised, but that is your prerogative. But for example, and I thought Miss Wallace, when she got up here, was finally going to take a position as to what they thought happened out there, but they won't do it. They want you to guess what happened. Let's talk about the blood, for example. Let's talk about the blood. That may have been important in your decision. You had the blood spatter man that came down from Oklahoma City, Tom Bevel. The blood may have been important, but I'll tell you what is missing in the blood is the chain of custody. You remember they got the clothing worn by Damon to the hospital, just like they got the t-shirt worn by Darlie to the hospital. But then it jumps from the hospital to the fire station number 2 over here where Maine picks it up. You see, you don't have Zimmerman. We objected and the judge overruled our objection. I still don't understand it. But the obligation is on them to prove what we call the chain of custody. And that is that they have to prove how the evidence was handled from the inception, where it was first observed and gathered, down to where it was analyzed. And they have got a missing link in the clothing worn by Damon and the t-shirt worn by Darlie. We know that when that evidence was gathered, it was soaking wet in blood. And what we don't know, and what they haven't brought us, is paramedic Zimmerman, who picked up the clothing. Y'all remember paramedic Zimmerman? He's the one that picked up the clothing at the hospital, put it all together, and took it to station 2, you see. Was the clothing of Damon permitted to contaminate the t-shirt of Darlie, and the t-shirt of Darlie to contaminate the clothing of Damon? I suspect it was. It was all soaked in blood, but you don't know. They haven't called paramedic Zimmerman. And I suggest to you the reason they haven't called him was because he will tell you, I put it all in a sack, you know, kind of like Maine out there. If I found it together, I put it all together. But they haven't brought paramedic Zimmerman. They have not explained those fingerprints that we talked about with consultant Cron as coincidental. If they have been compared with Glenn Mize, he never told me. I don't know whether they have or not. If they have been compared with Gary Austin down the way, they have never told me. If they were compared with the man who was turned in or phoned in by the used car lot. He said that afternoon. I thought it was that morning of the 6th, but I'll give him the afternoon, wearing the same clothes that Darlie had described. I don't know anything about it. And I would think that as part of his proof, when he comes to you and asks for death, that he would cover that. We don't know anything about the black car. We don't know anything about Angelia Rickles. No follow-up on that. They don't tell us about it until November. Well, what can we do in November? Thank you, but. And then when I go out there, they tell them, don't talk to anybody. Don't talk to anybody. What about Dr. DeMaio, who says these are defensive wounds? And again, any doubts that you have must be resolved in favor of Darlie. Again, I'm not fussing with your verdict, but I am saying that if they expect you to answer the ultimate question, then you are entitled to some answers and some explanations. Lisa Clayton told you that she has looked at her for some 12 and a half hours, and she is inconsistent with a mother who would harm or kill her children. She has none of the psychiatric makeup that she would expect to find in a mother who had killed her children. Dr. Townsend Parchman says that youngster would have lasted 5 or 6 minutes, maybe 8 or 9 minutes. And I noticed that Mr. Davis, in some hour that he had to answer our arguments back on Friday, totally ignored that timeline because there is no answer to that. If she is accurate, you know that it's inconceivable that she had the time and the ability to do those things. And again, you must resolve those doubts in her favor. She has no history of abuse. There is no motive. There is absolutely no reason. And we know at this stage that this wasn't a money type of deal. It's curious to me, and I have never for a minute doubted the innocence of Darren Routier. But he, of all people, had the most to gain here. She had a couple $100,000 worth of insurance on her. She doesn't gain anything monetarily. $5,000 apiece for those children, But they cleared him like that. What did they clear him on? They cleared him on what she said. They can pick and choose what she says. They can believe part of what she says and just discount for no rhyme or reason the other things that she says. But there is no reason or motive that has been demonstrated. And we all know that people don't do things without a reason or motive. Under Bevel's account, and Miss Wallace takes the position that the children were killed first. But again, we have got these spots of blood. And if it's a spot on a spot, and they're about 1 millimeter in diameter, so the chances of those being spots on top of a spot 3 times would be about the same as your chance of hitting the lottery. But either way, if the blood is mixed, that knife had to be wet with her blood for her to get those bloodstains on her t-shirt. Either she cut her throat first and then attacked the boys, and that doesn't make sense because how is she going to get the sock down the alley? That won't work. How is she going to get the sock down the alley without bleeding all over everything? That will not work. But it doesn't make sense that she stabbed them both first and then stabbed herself and then go back and stab them again either. That doesn't make sense. That won't work either. It doesn't make sense that she would cut her throat and then go over and lay down on the sofa and get blood on this pillow. That doesn't make sense, or at least to me. And if you resolve those doubts, when you think about the proof in this case and think about whether or not you have got death penalty proof here, you resolve those doubts in Darlie's behalf. The third consideration is the defendant herself in this case. She must be beyond redemption. I mean, what easier way or what better way to prove this than to show that she has a history, a track record of antisocial behavior? But you don't have that in this case. You have no antisocial behavior on the part of Darlie Routier. In fact, the evidence is to the contrary. She has no police record of any sort whatsoever. And there is absolutely no basis to believe from what you have heard that she would be capable of violence in the future. Why else? And in all my years of doing this, and I have been doing it a long, long time, and I feel like it too, but I have never, in all of the capital murder cases that I have tried, that I have prosecuted and defended, I have never seen a situation where all of the victim's relatives have rallied around the defendant. Obviously, they think they know her better than any of us do. I mean, I don't know her much better than you all do, but they have rallied around her because they believe that she is incapable of any act of violence of this magnitude. And as we think back and reflect on this, the people that we have known or the people that we have read about who have committed an unthinkable act of violence such as this have had that common thread where they have had a history of violence. They have had difficulties with the police. They have had problems at work and problems at home and problems in their family relationships. And you don't have that here. You don't have anything that suggests some maniacal, devious Darlie in this particular case. In his closing argument to you, Mr. Davis told you that this is simply another Susan Smith case. Do you remember that? Do you remember that on Friday? He said this is simply another Susan Smith case. Susan Smith, if you don't remember, is the mother from South Carolina who was sentenced to life imprisonment for drowning her two children. And let's compare this case with Susan Smith's. Susan Smith didn't have a stable marriage. In fact, the evidence was that Mr. Greg Davis says, "Excuse me, I'll object. That's outside the record." The court says, "Gentlemen." Mr. Mulder says, "Judge, he brought it up." Mr. Davis says, "No, I didn't." And the court says, "Gentlemen, both sides are instructed to stay within the record. The jury is instructed to remember the testimony as they heard it and be guided by the charge of the court. Mr. Mulder, you may continue." Mr. Mulder continues. Darlie has a stable marriage. She does not have a history of separation and divorce. Darlie has a record that she does not have a record of antisocial behavior. She has not had problems with coworkers. She has not had problems with family and friends. Her family supports her. I would suggest to you that many of the positions that Mr. Davis and the prosecution have taken are either flawed or faulty. I would suggest to you that at this time, you still don't know how it happened or why it happened or the time restraints that were involved here. Simply put, I guess their proof is just not so positive as to be infallible. And I would urge you not to make a decision based on this type of proof that is so final that it can't be undone. Tradition has it that the Indians believed that before they sat in judgment of one, that they would first walk in their moccasins. And as one last request, I would ask you that before you begin your deliberations on this most important issue, that you first read aloud in the jury room Darlie's journal, a very private documentary that reflects her very private, innermost thoughts. You have been most attentive, and I thank you for your time and for your attention. Thank you, Judge. Thank you, Mr. Mulder. Next up in closing is another one of the defense attorneys, Mr. Curtis Glover. And the court says, "Thank you, Mr. Mulder. Mr. Glover, may it please the court." "Yes, sir." "Judge, would you give me a 15-minute warning?" And the court says, "Yes, sir." And Mr. Glover then continues. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my thanks to you once again, and I am going to talk with you very briefly. There is a common thread that runs through all humanity, and that common thread that we have is that we are all fallible. And, I have noted throughout my life that we don't use the term fallible. Doug just used it and he said infallible. We like the word infallible. And if we want to go to contrary to infallible, we don't say fallible, we say not infallible. You say, what is he talking about? Well, we are all fallible, and you will agree to that. Anybody with an ounce of common sense buys into that. But in connection with that fallibility, we demand infallibility of certain persons in our society. We demand that they be infallible, though we know in common sense they really are not. We look at the president of our country and we say we want him to be infallible. We want our Secretary of State to be infallible because he represents us overseas. We want our governor to be infallible because he is in charge of our money. We want our local folks to be infallible because we look to them for leadership. We look to all of our elected officials. We look to our appointed police officers, and we say, we want you to be infallible. And there's a presumption of infallibility that goes along with them, simply because we want them to be infallible. We want our district attorney to be infallible. We want our elected district attorney to be infallible. We want his deputies to be infallible. And along with that want and that need, we presume that they are infallible. Now, how does that jade one's thinking? The fact that we engage and buy into that bit of human behavior. And I am as guilty as you of that. But how does it affect our thinking? How might it have affected your thinking in this case? We told you at the onset of this case that all persons charged with the crime are presumed to be innocent. And we ask you to indulge in that. And we ask every jury to indulge in that. But we as lawyers, we all know that is not indeed the case. We go in down because they have this presumption of infallibility, and you buy into their position easier than you might buy into a defendant's position. Let's look and see whether or not perhaps that might have occurred in this case to some degree. It occurs in every case because of that presumed infallibility and your need to rely on them. Now, in examining and trying to get into your minds as to what your deliberations concerned, I think that the most important evidence in this case was not that 911 call, nor was it that birthday party at the gravesite, but that was the most emotional thing in this case that you heard. The rest of the evidence that you heard in this case was extremely an attempt at being scientific, or some bureaucrat coming down from Washington and attempting to give you his leadership. And I think that the scientific or so-called scientific evidence in this case, the timeline, irrefutable timeline, was confusing. And you said, well, let's dismiss that. Let's rely on their infallibility and buy into their position. Perhaps the evidence of the blood, the evidence of the ambiance. It's all extremely confusing. You said, let's dismiss that. Let's go to the emotional aspects of this case and adopt that which they have asked us to do. Folks, when the conclusion was made in this case, and this has been said to you a dozen times, and I have got to say it again, when the conclusion was made in this case, 20 minutes after it was investigated, the die was cast and it could not be turned around. They went out and sought every way they possibly could to find anything that would indicate that her attitude was improper or that her behavior was improper. They said she didn't grieve properly. She was too stoic. Did you see her mother on that witness stand? That lady is stoic. We have those traits among us. We get them from our parents. Perhaps she is a stoic person. You will never know because you don't know Darlie Routier. All you know is her friends who have told you that she is a sincere and loving and good person. Nobody has said that she is not. Yet again, you had to buy into this infallibility that they enjoy and this position that they have. And you say, we have got to solve this matter. And we told you when you were on the selection of jurors, and I think each of you were told, that it is not your position here to solve this crime, though you indeed have. That was not your position. It was whether or not they had proven this case beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think, and I don't know, I simply have to conjecture about this, but I think you sat and you looked at the silly string business, you looked at the birthday party, and you said, that is inappropriate behavior. She must be guilty. We deduce she is guilty because they have not brought us any other possibility other than her guilt because she was there. We look at the 911 tape and we don't like some of the things that we hear because they are infallible and they pointed it out to us. And you will buy into it because of its infallibility. You know, folks, in every crime, I don't care whether it's a theft or a simple burglary or something simple on the street, somebody needs to be vindicated. The law doesn't say that it is the purpose of your sentencing someone that you are to vindicate someone, but we feel that in our minds. The victim of a theft wants to be vindicated. He wants to know that the perpetrator of the crime against him has been punished. Therefore, he has been vindicated. The victim of the burglary wants to know that the person that burglarized his house or his car has been punished. Thus, he has been vindicated. It's an important part of our system and the way we feel about law and order. Folks, there is nobody in this case to be vindicated by what you do here. Quite the contrary. These people have taken the witness stand, the people that know her best. The man that was there that night with her husband, who was in a better position to judge this than anybody on God's green earth, and he says she is innocent. There is nobody to be vindicated in this case. It's just like Doug said, in all matters like this, in every death penalty case he has ever seen, there was always somebody to be vindicated. Somebody to come into the courtroom and say, this was an evil person, now punish them. Nobody could do that in this case. There is nobody to be vindicated. There are only a large group of people, friends, those the closest, the family, to be further wounded by destroying this woman. Don't do it. Do not do that. Don't further wound these people than they already have been wounded. If there had been anybody who could mount that witness stand with any kind of sincerity and say that this is the way it should be, then perhaps you would have something to hang your hat on. But it's not here, folks. And you know, Greg is going to get up here, he or Toby one, and they are going to say, well, Glover says there is nobody to be vindicated in this case, but he is going to say that society needs to be vindicated. And he can argue that. But you and I know, and all of us have lost loved ones, and the only people that truly feel the terror and the awfulness of the situation are the close friends and family of the loved ones of the Devons and Damons of this world. And it's hollow words to say that society needs to be vindicated in this case. Society does not need to be vindicated in this case. There is nobody that can be vindicated. These people can only be further wounded if you decide to do that to Darlie. Think about this evidence, folks. Re-examine it and see whether in your heart of hearts that indeed you can vote to destroy this woman based on this kind of evidence. We're all fallible human beings. Do not do that. Thank you. Thank you, Judge. And the court says, thank you, Mr. Glover, Mr. Douglas. And that is where we are going to end right here. And we will pick up with the arguments from the prosecution, starting with Preston Douglas in the next episode. All right, so let's recap, okay? The prosecution opens up for the state and really twists Darlie Routier's words so that it makes it sound like she said that Darlie should die, leaving out the fact that she also said, but she didn't do this. The attorney, Sherri Wallace, further stretches the truth when she's telling the jury that they need to consider whether Darlie would re-offend if she is a danger to society. And the way that she plays this is by making it sound as if it was planned. Darlie had been sleeping downstairs for a week, so she must have planned this for a week. The window in the garage, according to the attorney, was open for a week. I don't recall this, but she uses this as a way of making it appear as though Darlie planned this as well. And then they proceed to talk about how she stood there in front of the butcher block considering what knife to use. No one knows that she did this, but the prosecution makes it out as if it's a fact. And then they relay a story about how the crime happened using the argument that it's a reasonable deduction. However, I don't know if you caught this. She never, ever mentions the sock. Now, the defense starts off by talking about Renee Stanley, the one that Darlie supposedly purchased cigarettes for, allowed her to drink a Zima out of the refrigerator and gave her some. And, Renee was all of 16 years old. The defense tells the jury that the prosecution knows where Renee is, but the reason that they didn't call her was because she denies all of this. Next, the defense talks about Eileen Shermer, how Eileen volunteered to testify. No one sought her out. She just wanted to do it. And Mulder made her out to be someone who just wanted to share in the spotlight. Next was Nelda Watts, and this is the woman who lived across the street from the Routiers, the retired school teacher. The same woman who said that she saw Darlie and Darren out in front of their home tossing items around that came from the wreaths that had been put outside the home. This is the same woman who saw a black car out in front of her house. And the night of the crime, once the emergency vehicles and paramedics began to arrive at the Routier home, this car took off. But the prosecution never asks Nelda about this. He then talks about Kay Norris, who worked for American Pawn, and the one that said that Darlie was, quote, trashy and rude. She too was another volunteer, just like Eileen. When Mulder talks about Helena, the woman who was at the house to clean a couple of days before the crime, and the one who said that Darlie was, practically smothering her baby, he does make a really good point that this is the only time since she has been in the United States that she has requested the use of an interpreter. And he makes another good point when he brings up the fact of Zimmerman. He is the one who took the items from the night of the crime, took the items from the hospital and put them together in a bag and then took them to a different location. He was never called to the stand. And Mulder then brings up a topic that no one has ever really touched on. How much more that Darren had to gain from this crime rather than Darlie. Darlie had life insurance on her for over $200,000. And how the police believed her when she talked about Darren and what Darren did that night, but then when she turns around and said what she did, it wasn't good enough. He then runs through all of the different scenarios as to how the sock could have gotten down the alley with the 2 spots of blood, and no scenario makes much sense. Mr. Glover of the defense then gets up and talks about essentially, when you look at authority figures, you automatically assume that they can do no wrong. Now, this is not true, but it's something that is ingrained in almost all of us. We don't want to believe that they can make mistakes, but they do. And this is where we end this episode. And we'll end up picking up with the remaining arguments along with the verdict in the next episode. Now, I want to add a little bit of my commentary here because some of this information that is coming up in these closings, why wasn't this brought up earlier in court? Why didn't they have some of these witnesses during the trial? It really doesn't make any sense to me because there's, questions like for Eileen, like if Eileen was put on the stand, this whole thing about the boat and the life jackets and the party, why wasn't she put on the stand by the prosecution? And, then the defense could go ahead and question her. Same thing about Kay Norris and the same thing about the neighbor across the street, the retired teacher. I mean, all of these sound like they would be probably pretty good witnesses to have on during the trial. I guess I'm just kind of surprised that they wouldn't have been a part of the trial and only show up when it comes to after the punishment phase. So I don't quite understand that. I'm sure there's a rhyme or reason to it, right? If somebody knows, please tell me because I am really confused about this. Anyway, that's all for this episode. If you're enjoying these episodes, please like and subscribe. And if you're on YouTube, click that bell so that you get notified of any upcoming episodes. Thank you all so much. We will talk very soon. Bye for now.